Nature's God and reproduction. What does nature's God have to say about the way in which human beings reproduce? By nature's God's design, an egg cell comes into place every month for the purpose of being fertilized. And a powerful, sustained sex drive is how nature's God manipulates us to reproduce. Now, that arrangement worked fine in our primitive existence when virtually every egg cell had the opportunity to be fertilized, and birth control was a matter of natural processes. The number of births was highly curtailed by the high mortality rate. Also, high percentages of embryos were spontaneously aborted then, as they are now. So one might say that abortion is in keeping with God's design. Now, there is no one in today's world that is advocating for strict adherence to the natural way of reproduction. There's no one advocating for giving every egg cell in every woman's body the opportunity to be fertilized. So we do not adhere to God's design, not as it was designed for our primitive existence anyway. So no one can now claim to be perfectly aligned with God's design. If we interfere with an egg cell becoming fertilized, that is not in keeping with God's design. So in light of the fact that our mortality rate now is many times higher or lower, our mortality rate now is many times lower than it was in our primitive existence, it is, I would think, incumbent upon us to manage things accordingly by resorting to our own methods of birth control. So, in keeping with the high mortality rate we were subject to as primitives, we restrict the number of egg cells that are given the opportunity to be fertilized through various methods of birth control. Now, given that nature's God allows for embryos to be spontaneously aborted as a further means of birth control in the natural world, it becomes evident that the whole purpose of human reproduction, as designed by nature's God, was not to maximize the number of possible births. Nature's screening process, as per the high mortality rate, was all about selecting for the more robust infants. And we have interfered with that screening process by allowing the less robust among us to survive. Now, is that in keeping with God's design? I don't know. Probably not. But that departure from God's design is ignored because we regard maximizing our birth rate as God's will. But it is evident from all the safeguards against a high birth rate in the natural world, it isn't God who necessitates the maximization of our birth rate, but ourselves. However, one must allow that it was in God's design for us to evolve out of our initial primitive state and establish highly developed civilizations wherein the natural state of things must be modified. The natural mode of reproduction cannot be allowed free rein and must be sensibly supervised by us. Nature's God, then, is no longer directly in charge of our reproductive system, but indirectly in charge, as we are extensions of God's will, and we can only behave as God has designed us to. So we are in charge of our reproduction, and we choose when to reproduce. We don't leave it up to nature alone. We don't leave it up to God. And to the question, when does a life begin? When does a new life begin? The answer is, a new life begins when we choose to have a child. Without that choice to have a child, there just wouldn't be any children. For if you believe that God created us, then you must believe our whole reproductive system is a product of God's design, and therefore should not be tampered with in any way. Clearly, things have changed, and we are responsible for the reproductive system, of how we reproduce. We choose when to have a child. We don't leave it up to God or nature. So, every woman of childbearing years makes a choice every month to be pregnant or not to be pregnant. And that choice is still viable if a woman finds herself inadvertently pregnant. Choice is viable to be pregnant or not to be pregnant. That's the woman's choice. And it's viable. That choice is viable up to a point. For the reality is, a fetus develops a functional nervous system when it is about 20 weeks old. So that might be a good time to regard the fetus as being something altogether separate from a woman's body. And 20 weeks should be ample time for any woman to realize that she's pregnant and make a decision about how she wants to proceed.